This is a CBC podcast.
Hey, I'm Michelle Parisi, the woman behind Alone, A Love Story. Season 3 is coming out on February 5th. Love, sex, travel, motherhood, it's all in there. You don't expect anything less from me by now, do you? So put on some tea, make some space under the blankets, and get ready to hunker down with the final season of Alone, A Love Story.
Danse, Anine, bonjour, hello, and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. In popular culture, Indigenous people are often portrayed as being of the past, living traditional lives, or they're not shown at all. And aside from a few characters, like my personal favorite, Chakotay from Star Trek, Indigenous people aren't often portrayed as existing 10, 50, or even 100 years from now. So what does it mean for Indigenous people to look to the future and see themselves there?
We all know about the holodeck in Star Trek. So what would our holodeck look like?
Starting to get us to think about what's in the future for us. What are we going to be doing 10, 20, 100 years from now?
And that's part of the joy of our writing these stories, is that we do see ourselves in the future.
And that world, to me, is part of some incredible imagined future that we might get to one day.
This week on Radio Indigenous, how Indigenous people are thinking, writing, and portraying themselves in the future. Now, before we get too deeply into this, a little context. The term Indigenous futurism was first coined by my first guest, Dr. Grace Dillon from Portland State University. Since coining the term, she has edited a collection of short stories called Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction, which is the first of its kind. She joins me from Portland. Welcome, Grace.
Welcome, and thank you.
Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with the genre, what is Indigenous futurisms?
Indigenous futurisms is an area where Indigenous writers can create thought experiments in a scientific sense and center Indigenous people within that world. As Helen Haig Brown, who is from the Chakotay Nation and has created the film The Cave in her own language, she has called it taking the fiction out of science fiction. And in the process of that, sharing the values and ethics that are connected to science, which is ceremony, singing, dancing, all forms of art, along with growing plants, developing medicines, creating space rockets.
Space rockets and canoes, that's us.
And space canoes. Thank you.
So essentially, it's taking the ancient knowledge that Indigenous peoples have always carried, and maybe or may not have been aware of, but still carry, into what it might look like in a future setting.
Yes, and to go even further, because I just realized, the reason why I was even interested in science fiction is that as a little girl growing up with our Anishinaabe stories, our stories combined science with art. That's the way I learned science. Mm-hmm. That's the way I would learn about plants. I would learn about how a certain kind of frog could slip into bushes that would have been poisonous for others, right? And then you learn about the poison of that bush through that story. So growing up with those kind of stories is just a natural part of your living and culture and being. Then when you see science and you are fascinated with science, it is the medium that is most interesting mm-hmm. is to tell that science as a story.
Right, yeah. Why do you think it's important that Indigenous people write about themselves in a future setting?
Well, so often, so many of us are viewed as the last of the race, or the lost race, or the vanishing race, or It was fascinating because I was just at the University of Minnesota for just a spectacular conference put on by undergraduates. They were just amazing. And it was on the anthropology of science fiction. And, I was giving my talk on Indigenous futurism, and then there was one very sweet elderly gentleman who asked, and he had asked very thoughtful and intelligent questions throughout, and he asked me in real seriousness, and he said, "So, do you see yourself as natives existing in the future?" And I was a little startled, because from my perspective, yes, no problem.
Check.
But I could tell he was really worried about that.
Really?
And I said, "Oh, yes, and that's part of the joy of our writing these stories, is that we do see ourselves in the future, and we're, in a way, contemplating and just experimenting. It's a thought experiment with what that could be like, and how can we be mutually responsible."
So in 2018, the movie Black Panther was a hugely successful hit, and it brought an interest in Afrofuturism to the mainstream. And Black Panther was popular not only among Black audiences, but also Indigenous audiences. I remember going to see this movie and crying.
Yeah.
It was so emotional. So do you think we're going to see like an Indigenous version of Black Panther very quickly, or when do you think that we'll be able to get emotional about our own movies?
Yes. There's a couple projects that I actually cannot speak about because of non-disclosure agreements, but the one that I can refer to, and it'll be Daniel H. Wilson. He's Cherokee, and his novel Robo-Apocalypse was bought up by Steven Spielberg, and now Michael Bay is the director of that film, and they're going to make it into a big, big blockbuster film. Cool. So, and that's centered with Cherokee people and the Osage Nation. So we'll see what happens with the film. But I really, to be perfectly honest, I think the big breakout will be when you have Indigenous filmmakers that are making the film. Mm-hmm. Although there are some amazing filmmakers that are getting in touch with us and spend a great deal of time shifting their film and being very respectful. So there are those kind of possibilities too. But yes, I absolutely foresee that happening.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Aw, thank you so much.
I'm going to call you back tomorrow and we'll chat.
And I say, have fun, you guys, with Indigenous futurism. There's so much out there.
That was Grace Dillon, professor at Portland State University. She's the editor of Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. This week we're exploring Indigenous futurism, so there's no better time to talk about Indigenous people in space. Lou Cornum is a writer and graduate student who wrote an article called The Space Indians Star Map for the New Inquiry, which takes a look at what it means for Indigenous people to be seen as space explorers. Lou joins me from New York City. Welcome, Lou.
Hello.
Now, Lou, in the article, you talk about the first time that you saw a fictional depiction of an Indigenous person in space. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
Right, so that's the short film, The Sixth World, and it was kind of this revelation for me. It's about a Navajo commander who's on the spaceship hurtling towards Mars with the intent of growing corn crops there. And in the film, there's like these genetically modified corn crops, but by the end, she's returned to the ancestral corn crops as kind of humanity's one chance for life on Mars. Seeing that film was, the first time I think I saw an Indigenous person in space that was like explicitly Indigenous and based on like a real living Indigenous culture, as opposed to something like Avatar, right, where they're obviously meant to be modeled on Indigenous people, but it's much more, the romanticized image than anything drawn from a real practice of indigeneity.
Yeah. And so how did it make you feel to see an Indigenous person in space in an Indigenous story?
I think it really answered a sort of loneliness that I'd had. And thinking that I'd often sort of identified with the alien or the figure of the alien just because I was so interested in space, but also feeling alienated. Yeah. So then seeing this film and knowing that there was some other Navajo person out there who was also thinking about traveling to Mars was like incredible to think that you weren't alone in having these kinds of visions, or that this wasn't something that was alien to being Indigenous, that you could be from one place and still dream about traveling to another.
When you say it answered a loneliness for you, did you even know that you were lonely up until then?
Well, yeah, I think that I'd always felt, I was living in New York City at that time, and I've lived in New York City since I was 18, and there are many Native people here, but we're all sort of scattered. It's really feels like only in the last 2 years that I've started to meet and connect to a Native community here in the city. So the loneliness was both because I didn't have a sort of community around, and also just feeling the isolation of the nerd or the weird, being like a preoccupation with things that don't fit into what are supposed to be like Indigenous interests or seem relevant to Indigenous culture. But then, it's like after seeing this movie and sort of getting more into Indigenous futurism, you start to realize that there have been these aspects actually kind of in your life all along. Star Wars is a huge thing for Navajo people.
Yes.
Which I kind of started to realize, like, oh, there's like this whole seemingly like kind of cultural connection to Star Wars that I thought, this is just my weird, nerdy predilection. But that there's actually something that is connecting for a lot of us.
Now, your research focuses on Black and Indigenous science fiction. What do these subgenres offer that traditional sci-fis like Star Trek doesn't?
Well, I think it picks up on the metaphors of colonialism that are often in science fiction, or, so Star Trek, this idea of exploration, of contact, and it reorients the viewer or the reader to looking at those histories from maybe the margins or from the obscured positions. So to reimagine the defining aspects of colonial encounters like contact and say, why does that have to be a moment of antagonism or the precursor to conquest? So taking these big ideas in science fiction and saying, well, it doesn't have to be that narrative, that we can take this same setting, the same idea, but transform it so that it's not inevitable that colonialism happens or that slavery happens, that those transformations are possible, not just in the future, but to reflect back onto the present. So it becomes a powerful way to just imagine how things could be different and could have been different.
So it's a retelling almost.
Yeah, a retelling and a kind of not just telling the same story, right, but transforming what the assumptions are that make the story even possible.
Right. Now, in the introduction of Star Trek, the famous line, space is the final frontier, dun, 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 which brings to mind this idea of untouched land, of colonization, as you said. So where do people of color currently fit in these stories about space, or do they fit at all?
Well, usually the role that is sort of metaphorically tied to people of color through the image of the alien is, this mysterious other or this like uncivilized savage, right? Because they're alien, they're already dehumanized. So it becomes an easy placeholder for people who are dehumanized on Earth to inspire these figures in outer space. So, except I guess Star Trek and Star Wars have both been trying to become more like multicultural in who their heroes are, right? So that there's not just like the white male hero. But often that was in the golden age of sci-fi or the classic sci-fi. We have, the white male hero encountering these like strange beings. And those strange beings will often literally be like aliens of color because they'll be different colors or have these other kinds of markers that are meant to subtly or not so subtly remind us of different races or ethnicities from Earth. So I've thought a bit about, the figure of the savage alien being both a stand-in for Black or Indigenous subjects, and often the idea of like a swarming alien intelligence being a manifestation of anxieties around immigration.
Wow. That is an interesting way to look at it. I'd never seen it that way before. As you outline in your article, the idea of a person of color living, working, and exploring space can be jarring to some audiences. Why do you think that that's the case?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that science fiction, and specifically space, is a space of the future. And it's very troubling for those who want to keep Indigenous people in a historic past, which is sort of a safe place for indigeneity to be constrained to, because then it doesn't make its demands to the dominant society, right? So then it's troubling to think about that difference that Indigenous people bring and that they advocate for into a future.
So what you're saying is there's this unspoken understanding or assumption that we're all going to be dead in the future.
Right. Or that we're not even supposed to be here in the present. So this future becomes troubling, whether it's, America or Canada or whatever sort of colonial state is always trying to perpetuate itself into the future, to think that there will still be this challenge from the prior occupants of these lands.
In your article, you write about how Indigenous peoples would explore space differently. How would we uniquely explore space?
This is where I get into just the idea of contact. A form of contact that is not based on immediately enforcing a hierarchy of beings, right? So to allow like a true exploration that is about openness and is about connection rather than about conquest or about control or about extraction. So, with a lot of the industries around space travel now, it's about how can we go into space and find these deposits of some sort of energy source, because we've exasperated all the sources here on Earth. So it's just sort of continuing the same process of extraction until exhaustion, but in space. And I think that that's such a shame in the way that it's a shame here on Earth, but it's also a shame because there's so much wonder that I feel thinking about space, and just the encounter with this like radical, awesome difference, to think that you would encounter that and then just immediately want to control and extract is a very sad way to think about space for me. And I think what Indigenous practice offers is another way of interacting with this world, but also just interacting with worlds generally.
Indigenous science fiction is a growing genre. What do you think the value of these stories are?
Well, the empowering part of just seeing yourself in a future is perhaps the first and most obvious to me. So many people just personally can't imagine a future for themselves. So to collectively be able to create a very distant future and to say, we will make it there, that just by heralding it, you're making it possible, right? That image of the future.
Thank you, Lou, for your time today.
Yes, thank you.
Lou Cornum is a writer and graduate student at the University of New York. To read their article from the New Inquiry, visit our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. Still to come on Unreserved, is the future of fashion Indigenous? A Como Pueblo designer, Lauren Aragon's futuristic fashion line is inspired by the strength of women and aliens?
I kind of studied the alien culture a little bit further, and I started to notice that there's a matrilineal system involved. So matrilineal system involved in the movies, and matrilineal system involved in our beliefs, and just kind of tied the two ideas together. But we introduced the alien xenomorph collection, which was on dresses and tees. To me, it's the ultimate strength of the women to create life, and that's all really what the aliens want.
That story in just a few minutes. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Envisioning the future today as we explore Indigenous futurisms. And you can't talk about futurisms without talking about technology. Indigenous Matriarch for Media Lab, or IM4 Media Lab, is running free workshops for Indigenous artists, storytellers, producers, and community members to learn about VR, AR, and 360 video. They're happening in Vancouver in partnership with Emily Carr of Art and Design, with a goal of teaching students the skills they need to create immersive virtual reality experiences. We headed out to one of their workshops to find out more.
My name is Adrienne Larocque, and I'm here today at the IM4 360 video workshop. I'm Cree from Musqueam, Alberta, and I work with the First Nations Technology Council. I was interested in taking this class because I wanted to learn what the potential applications of this kind of having virtual reality and 360 videos could be applied in education. But the other side of that, too, is I'm interested in how I could incorporate it into my own artistic expression as well. So it's a little bit twofold for me. In the last couple days, I've collected footage for a 360 video. So I recorded myself setting up how I would normally set up my beading table at home. And I captured some video of me beading, and I just kind of added like a little bit of a narrative over top of that about, you know, thinking about what does it mean to be an Indigenous person today in the modern world, and how do I incorporate that into my art.
We are in one of the workshops that the IM4 Lab is offering to the Indigenous community here in Vancouver and at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. What's happening is this is an introductory class to VR production. My name is Loretta Todd. My family is one of the original families from the Red River, the Métis Red River. Our family is also from the St. Paul Métis settlement and also Whitefish Lake First Nations, and we also have relatives in Turtle Mountain in the Dakotas, the Chippewa. And I have lived in Vancouver for many years as a filmmaker. So virtual reality is the intersection of technology and taking you into a virtual space. So the technology is taking you out of the physical space and taking you into the virtual space. We are also involved in what is called AR, and AR is another form of where it's sort of an interaction between virtual and the real. So that would be like Pokemon Go, that kind of game. We're also doing AR training as well and production. This actually, for me, goes back to another time when I was first starting out as a filmmaker, and there was a conference at Banff, and I was invited to help organize a panel with Indigenous people who were looking at these new technologies. Technologies back in the 90s, VR was not what it is today, but it still was in its sort of beginning phases, and there was still a lot of talk about what is virtual reality. So we brought together some great speakers, and one of them was Dr. Leroy Littlebear, and he talked about virtual reality. He says, we've always had virtual reality. Virtual reality is when we go on quests, when we go into other places beyond this dimension. That's something that stayed with me this whole time. So as I saw virtual reality getting bigger and kind of coming back into play in applications in healthcare and education, but that always was driving me in terms of ensuring that we look at virtual reality from an Indigenous perspective, that we indigenize virtual reality, that we aren't just kind of taking the technology and, putting the visors on and going, oh, now we do virtual reality. No, we're indigenizing it, and that's the whole point of the IM4 Lab.
My name is Jason Wong. I'm Gitxsan from the Gitxsan Nation. I'm in the program just to learn a little bit more about virtual reality and the application itself in connection with a capstone project that I worked on in the Executive MBA program in Indigenous Business and Leadership at SFU, where I did a concept feasibility paper on the use of virtual reality as a learning tool in education. In this project, I've got a great partner here with Caroline. We're just working on a project that takes us through the Aboriginal gathering place and welcomes us into the area and kind of shows us the space and the artifacts and the cultural items that are in the space as well. It was really interesting to learn about virtual reality and all of the little tools and that go into making just a short piece like this. It's a great learning process. What really interests me is the potential of using virtual reality with the main focus on non-Indigenous people who don't have that lived experience or that real understanding of Indigenous people, their identities, culture, traditions, governance, spirituality, language, everything that goes into it, and actually being able to have them put into an immersive experience where it'll be more engaging. I think is far better than opening a book and looking at pictures. Actually being immersed in an experience and seeing and feeling what's going on around you.
This word futurism is something that I know the Indigenous community has embraced. A lot of communities have embraced that. The African American community has, because often we don't get to voice our future. Our future is really, the past. That's kind of been what we've been told, that really, we don't belong to the future. But I also find it complicated because in an Indigenous sense, there is no past, present, and future. That they all kind of coexist. And again, I draw on teachings from, Dr. Leroy Little Bear and, my own teachers, and this idea of how time isn't experienced in quite the same way and isn't expressed in quite the same way. So the future doesn't really mean the same thing. But politically, it means a lot, because to be able to say that we are here and will be forever, that we're not just, from before, that we are beyond, and that we are timeless, and that we will go on forever is really an important political act, and we have to say that. Kind of exciting too, because of course, a lot of us who are involved in this are sci-fi nerds or science nerds and so on, and some of us are Trekkies, and of course we all know about the holodeck on in Star Trek. So what would our holodeck look like, right? And what would its purpose serve? I think those are all things people have talked about, having to use VR to help, recreate time before. But also, it's also imagining, this beyond, right? So we see ourselves forever.
That was filmmaker and organizer Loretta Todd, as well as students Adrian Larocque and Jason Wong, at a recent IM4 Media Lab workshop in Vancouver, teaching people how to design VR experiences. The free introductory and intermediate workshops have taken place in different parts of British Columbia. Thanks to the CBC's Anne Penman for sharing that story. Indigenous futurism is popping up in writing, film, art, and video games, but it's also appearing in more wearable art, fashion.
We are a women's couture evening gown, evening dress designer. Really, we are a celebration of the strength and empowerment of women. So taking a lot of the background in our culture, which is a matrilineal system to begin with, and our pottery art culture, and really trying to portray a lot of those thoughts and ideas in the art culture as well into fashion.
That's Lauren Aragon, the co-founder of Akinav, a women's fashion line. Many of Lauren's pieces are black and white with detailed geometric patterns, inspired by Acoma Pueblo pottery designs. But Lauren's journey into fashion might surprise you. Unreserved's Stephanie Cram has more.
Lauren Aragon says his family pushed him to pursue a career in technology, so he went into mechanical engineering. But a trip to the Santa Fe Indian Market, the largest annual Indigenous arts market in the United States, inspired him to pursue a more creative field.
Art was always in my background. My mother always encouraged me to try different things and explore creativity. And so it stuck with me through the years, but it wasn't until the first time I went to the Santa Fe Indian Market, which is really what struck the inspiration to be a part of that whole art community. And just seeing the progression in the native arts, in both traditional and modern, was just really overwhelming, and I wanted to be a part of that.
Aragon says that fashion seemed like the most obvious choice for a creative job, since he saw parallels between engineering and fashion design.
A lot of times I had to take things apart, so reverse engineer and figure things out. So it's the same way with fashion. How does this garment go together, and trying to figure that out. And then I soon realized that there's a lot of math involved. We're trying to work with, especially with curvatures of the body, and there's this totally different change in how I looked at things, as far as straight lines and hard edges to soft curves, and the body form, just trying to work with that.
Aragon is part of the growing trend of designers drawing inspiration from ideas of what the future looks like. His clothing is undeniably modern, even futuristic looking. But for Lauren, looking to the future also means drawing inspiration from the past.
I think there's always going to be a tie to tradition, always going to be a tie to culture in some way. Yeah, so we're mostly known for our pottery art, and a lot of our ancestral designs were monochrome, so black on white pots. And I like to say that we are kind of the fine china of the Pueblo art culture and Pueblo pottery culture. Our pottery, again, is a lot of geometrical designs which are laid out in fine line details, a lot of zigzags. A lot of the designs that are portrayed in our pottery art are really representative of life itself.
So, how does this connection to the past also look forward to the future? And what does that look like in clothing? Aragon looked to pop culture and film specifically. The Alien franchise inspired a xenomorph Hanu collection, and he found a surprising connection to his own indigenous culture in the films.
I kind of studied the alien culture a little bit further, and I started to notice that there's a matrilineal system involved. So matrilineal system involved in the movies, and matrilineal system involved in our beliefs, and just kind of tied the two ideas together. But the alien design that I came out with is a very Membries style design. Membries being an animal or some kind of creature that's portrayed in two-dimensional art on pottery. So I took that design of the alien profile and made my own Membries styles, a futuristic Membries style, so to speak, and introduced that on first decals, which were a big hit, and then people really wanted to see it on more wearable art. So we introduced the Alien Xenomorph collection, which was on dresses and tees. Again, it's just a celebration of the matrilineal system that's in the film there, and just kind of, to me, it's the ultimate strength of the women to create life, and that's all really what the aliens want. Yeah, a lot of people are surprised that you can take those ideas and go deeper with it.
Aragon is part of a larger trend of Indigenous people thinking about the future to challenge the idea that Indigenous people are a thing of the past and extinct. Through his clothing designs, he draws from the past but drives that narrative so far into the future he's reached into outer space. For him, these narratives are important because they assert that Indigenous people are here to stay.
Futurisms, I think, is starting to get us to think about what's in the future for us. You know, where are we going to be? What are we going to be doing 10, 20, 100 years from now? And I'm glad that that's really at the forefront, because that's, again, what we try to push is try to influence the younger generations to start thinking about, you know, what is the future going to be? You know, you have to get off the reservation. You have to go explore outside of your hometowns and where you're from, and really try to find your own identity and bring that back to your culture, bring that back to your people, and share that with everyone.
That was Lauren Aragon, one of the creators of Akanav, a women's fashion line based out of Phoenix, Arizona. Thanks to Unreserved's Stephanie Cram for that. The first time May's Longboat saw Indigenous representation in video games, it was in the world of Warcraft. The animal-like character was loosely based on Native American culture. Longboat, who is Mohawk and French-Canadian, is now doing thesis work in media studies at Concordia University in Montreal, creating a video game that reflects his own experiences as an Indigenous person. The only problem was he didn't know how to make a video game, so he got some help. With him is Ray Capelin, who is a Mi'kmaq artist from Listagouche and is helping with the visual aspects of the game. They're here to talk about Terra Nova, their video game based in the future. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi.
So, Maze, tell me the concept of the game.
So Terra Nova is set on Earth far, far in the future after a cataclysmic event kind of shook the planet. And it was this cataclysmic event that kind of caused a subset of humanity to board a giant starship and leave to go find a new home on a different planet. Meanwhile, not all of the people could go on that journey, and so the people that were left behind essentially were tasked with rebuilding the damaged Earth and kind of forming a new relationship with the planet. So since that subset of humanity left to go colonize another Earth, the Earth has started to heal, but then the game takes place when those that left return. And unknowingly return back to Earth, their home, which they do not remember.
Here we are on new contact sort of situation. What is the goal of the game?
The goal of the game is to essentially have a first contact experience. The game is actually a two-player cooperative game. And so 2 players side by side, essentially in the same room, have to control each character, Terra and Nova, and navigate through a series of platforms and puzzles towards one another, and then have a dialogue and an interface with one another. So the goal essentially is to cooperate, to communicate, and to figure out what the future may hold for both together.
Mm-hmm. And then you approached Ray to help with the creation of the game. Ray, what interested you in this project?
Many different aspects of this project interest me. One being I have myself a profound interest in video games. I want to do video games. I want to create art and media for video games. And 2, the concept that Maze presented to me, or the idea of the video game, was really drawing. It drew me in. It's a mix of sci-fi, but also a mix of indigenous themes and that sort of stuff. So I was immediately drawn by it.
Can you describe what the game looks like?
Yes. Since I'm the only artist on this game and the only animator, I have full reign over everything that's been being shown, but of course with help by Maze of directing me and the creative side of the art. So the game is sort of like the style anyways. It's kind of like an 8-bit kind of retro-looking game, sort of, with pixel art style, like resemblance of Super Nintendo and stuff like that. I mean, the look of the game is like, picture like destroyed like cities, flooded because the earth has warmed up, and the society of people, this culture living on top of these cities, literally on these broken skyscrapers, and their culture has sort of adapted to, repurpose a lot of the forgotten and lost material by the people that left the earth. And I guess that's where I can definitely apply some little indigenous themes and subtleties in the culture that they're using to repurpose the stuff left behind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maze, why did you want to set your game in the future?
The inspiration for the game kind of came from a concept more so than a story. The story was kind of born out of the concept, and that concept was one that many indigenous cultures and societies know as first contact with, I guess, settler peoples. So starting there, I wanted to tell a story of first contact, but I didn't really want to do it in a historically framed kind of manner. I wanted to create something new and something that had the possibility for many different outcomes of that contact to happen. So instead of just focusing on the war and destruction or the disease that came out of first contact, making room for that to happen again in the future, but also potentially seeing the hope of what, I guess, the coming together of 2 cultures, indigenous and settler, could mean in the future.
Why do you think it's important to show indigenous people in the future?
I think oftentimes indigenous folks aren't told that they have a future. I've worked with lots of indigenous youth over the years through work and school, and when kind of prompted to envision what their future looks like in a week or a month or a year or several years, it's kind of hard for them to put into words. So I think it's projects like the one Ray and I are working on, why those are important for showing not only indigenous youth, but our communities kind of like what is possible and what we're all kind of like striving for.
Yeah. Earlier we talked about loosely basing characters on indigenous people. What does it mean to both of you to know that this game is inspired by indigenous people and made by indigenous people?
I think it's great. I think it's wonderful knowing that indigenous people have created a game with very subtle indigenous elements. And again, a lot of the characters in this game, they don't have a lot of stereotypical things because, in a way, I guess we're trying to stop that, I guess.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of misrepresentation, and so I guess it's us trying to contribute to reclaiming that sort of thing.
Exciting. Gamers everywhere are marking their calendars. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosanna.
Maze Longboat and Ray Capelin are designing a video game called Terra Nova, which will be out later this year. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. Special thanks to Ann Penman this week. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Agosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.